Welcome to the Wheel and Tire Industry Insights powered by the Wheel and Tire Council. This is the first of 7 webinars that WTC is hosting. Today, we will focus on Tire Knowledge Segment 101. My name is Tyson Boyer. I'm with Wheel Air Controls and humbled to be the chair of the Wheel and Tire Council. Thanks for joining in today. We definitely appreciate you being here, taking time out of your day. We trust it'll be pretty beneficial on both sides, not only from your questions that you ask, but also from the answers from a couple of our experts that we have today. Without further ado, let's get into it. Our first individual would be Gary Reedy. Gary's with Discount Tire Company and is the quality and technical expert that has years of experience in from testing to dissecting the specs, anything involving the tire and wheel assembly and space. So Gary, welcome.
Thank you.
As well, we have Kent Hobson with Sam's Club. Kent is the tire and battery operations with all of Sam's tire bays and service centers with years of experience as well. So welcome, Kent.
Thank you, Tyson. I appreciate that. I sound kind of pathetic next to Gary's big introduction there. I should have done better on that. My bad.
So, you know, this is, we all know that this is kind of the first one, right? So things could go awry. Hopefully not, right? Hopefully we'll all be streamlined here. But so bear with us. With that said, as most of you probably know or saw, in 2019, we kicked off the inaugural The Stage at SEMA in the South Hall. And this really is a build off of The Stage a little bit more in depth, a little more technical to provide a wider audience, especially those that are, you know, making decisions that revolve around installation, service practices, things around the tire and wheel assembly, and of course, hands-on with technicians in the bay. This definitely impacts them every single day. So with that said, let's get into this. Please post your questions in the chat bar. There is going to be little notes that pop up. Feel free to share. Thank you to all those that did submit questions at the beginning. We will try to address as many as we can. There are a couple of them that we will hold over to actually future segments. So we appreciate that. There's some great questions. And with that, let's dive into this. Gary, let's kick it off with how do we determine a proper application in regards to tire load carrying capacity?
Well, as far as, you know, ideally, it's nice to put the OE stuff right back on because that's bread and butter. You don't have to worry about it. But sometimes that can get complicated too. The 5 things that we like to concentrate on are basically the correct load carrying capacity of the tire set at the right air pressure, it's on the correct rim width, and the tire and wheel don't interfere with any parts of the car, suspension. And then the 5th one is probably one of the most important, is educate the customer that, you know, that you're not going to be able to run 35 anymore. You might have to run 45, or of the changes and then the handling differences that he might notice, or she. So as far as those are just the top 5 things that you really want to cover, and getting an understanding. Working, and you know, you get a Dodge Caravan that comes in and it's got a 225/60/16 and it's a European metric, which means it has no P in the front, so it's built to the European standards, so it has a max of 36 psi and the load index would be 98. Well, Ford builds the same size tire and goes on their Lincoln Continental and it's a P metric, and it's basically a 96 load index at a max of 35 psi. So you got to pay attention to the two. While they are different, prior to 2005, there was a difference. In 2005 and later, they did what they referred to as harmonized. So they agreed on one specification. Essentially, how we treat it at my company is it's the same size tire and at the same air pressure, going to carry the same load. So we treat the P metric and the hard metric the same. The max load is achieved 36 psi. It's 1 psi. Your tire gauge is not that accurate. So that's one application that you can easily understand of what you're doing. And some of the things that, to look for. Tire and Rim Association is the US standards. Now those standards, they don't have to build to. It's a kind of a recommendation or a requirement. What it is all the tire manufacturers got together and said, hey, if we all agree on one spec, it's a standard and it protects the tire companies. And ETRTO or Europeans did the same thing. Now they've globalized or harmonized, so it makes it a little easier on us. But with some of the other markets coming in, with the commercial trucks and stuff like that, it gets a little more complicated. But we're not going to get that far into it today. Standard load tires. One of the questions I think was how to identify a standard load or an extra load. A lot of people don't realize that there are preset or predetermined max air pressures on the sidewall that will tell you if it's a standard load or extra load. Standard load tires usually will have a 35, a 36, a 44, or a 51 as a max PSI, because that's the max PSI for standard load tires. As far as if it's an extra load, it's going to have a max pressure of 41, 42, 49, or 50. And that's your max load for max loads. And the reason you have a difference in the 41, 42, and 49 and 50 is Europeans round down, we round up, comes out to like 41.6. When you go from KPA to PSI, it's like 10 KPA, which is the metric measurement for pressure.
Right.
So you get into the weeds, but 1 PSI. But as far as, then there's always the load index. Not every tire has one. Now, nowadays, pretty much everything does. But if you run across a tire that doesn't have one, look at the max load, and then you can go to a load index chart and look it up reversely. Because all a load index is a number that says, I carry this much weight. Like a 120 is 3,084.
Right. So Kent, let's add a little bit more into this. Can you give us a little insight from your side in regards of standard versus extra load and your approach?
Well, sure. And it's very similar to, and it's a funny thing, real quick, I just want to mention this. You have two competitors on this call, Tyson, right? Gary with Discount, I'm with Sam's. But one thing we don't compete on, we work together on, Gary, is safety, right? So that's another reason why we're having this. And we agree with the Discount tire. We have the same kind of approach. We want to get the folks back into the original equipment tires that came on it. But hey, come on, we're SEMA, right? People are on here for a reason. And what do the folks normally do? The first thing they want to do, if they're going to customize, they're going to get new shoes and some new feet. Maybe they're just going to get some new tires. Maybe they're going to get wheel and tire combinations, okay? And we have to know then, Tyson, if it's a standard load, if it's an extra load, we have to know all kinds of stuff to go into it. But it's the same thing. You have to look on the sidewall. Most of the time it'll say extra load on the sidewall. And also there's a light load, Gary, but that's really kind of an oddball thing you don't see very much. It's when you have a wide, short tire. You have like a 285, 35, 19 that gets a light load because it's really for something that's not necessarily going to be on the road. It may be racing, it may be other applications. But Gary's exactly right. If we can take this a little further, Tyson, if you don't mind, as we go into folks that want to go, Gary, different from OE. If they want to plus size, do a +0, keep the same size rim, +1, you're going to add 1 inch to it, +2 or 2 inches, +3, 3 inches. But we still have to maintain a certain percentage, right? We have to, of the original equipment overall diameter of the tire. We're not talking about customization here where we're jacking trucks up real big and putting crazy stuff on them. We're talking just an everyday driver that someone wants to do a little bit something different with. We still have to maintain a plus or minus 3% of the original equipment tire overall diameter. And that should keep us within specs, not having to change a whole lot of things. But we still may need to, Gary, increase or decrease the air pressure depending on what we're doing, right?
Right, yeah, as far as, 3% that's an ideal specification as far as for a perfect world. A lot of times, a lot of people, sometimes they want to go higher than that. They want to go 5% taller or 10% taller, and it still fits in the fender well. But, ideally the 3% or the nice applications are people that buy the base model Jetta that comes with 15s. They want to put the 17s on that came on the GLI model of the Jetta. And you can run into problems just with that application because you have to go off the placard. Just because it's the same car doesn't mean it has the same load or same intended use. Intended use was something you'll understand because NHTSA, all they require for the vehicle manufacturers, the tire has to exceed half the axle weight. So if you got a 7,000 pound axle, 3,500 pounds, what your tires got to carry. That's static. That's not, they're not talking about cornering and handling. They're just talking direct load. There's a lot more forces that go into it. And your manufacturers want a load carrying capacity that, on a F-250, it's usually about around 300 pounds more per tire load carrying capacity than what the axle weight is, because we don't check our tire all the time, and that's the load carrying part of it. And also for handling and cornering and braking, and you decide to tow something and you didn't add air. So I mean, there's a lot of things that can go wrong in there, and that's why the manufacturer wants that extra buffer of safety. And for those of us that are really enthusiasts, when you go over 75 miles an hour, the load decreases at a greater rate the faster you go. So keep in mind that if you have a Mercedes with an Autobahn package and you can't go to 22s when the regular Autobahn, the non-Autobahn S-Class can, it's because that car is designed to run at 135 miles an hour for an elongated period of time and carry a certain weight. So a lot of that's intended use. It's the same vehicle, but it's just got that highway gear. So you have to keep that in mind. And instead of knowing all that stuff, just looking at the placard and saying, this tire, this load index, this air pressure, and you look it up and it carries this much weight. That's the weight you want to maintain, whatever tire you put on there. And, Kent brought up a good one on a Chevy truck the other day. Going from a P to an LT.
And how did you handle that, Kent?
I didn't. I let somebody else handle it. No, actually, anytime you have a passenger tire in a non-passenger application, which is a truck, right? And the reason why is that? Well, because trucks are the Cadillac of the 80s, right? I mean, you do everything in trucks now. Somewhere a truck ain't a truck no more. Does that make sense? It has so much stuff on it, and they want a nice smooth ride. But a buddy of mine wanted to go from the OE 18-inch tires that were on it, the Duelers, I think they were Bridgestone Duelers, to a more all-terrain type tire. And of course, sure, we can do that. But here's the question I want to throw out there for everyone to think about just for a second. You open the door and the door placard says 30 or 35 PSI. Okay, well, it's going to be same size tire, only I'm doing a little different here because I'm going with an LT versus a P. Well, what do we need to do? Well, first we have to reduce our load on that passenger rated tire by 1.1, and then we have to figure out on our load and inflation tables what kind of air we need to put in the LT tire. And it turns out the door said he needed 35. If we went back with the door placard original pressure in that LT tire, we would have been severely under load capability. We had to bump it up to 47 PSI to meet the required load for that vehicle. So go ahead, Tyson, I'm sorry.
No, I said, Kent, critical point, and I don't mean to cut you off. Ironically, a number of the questions that came in with some of the RSVPs were around TPMS, actually, and understanding, how to manage that, right? Like the vehicle's OE PSI versus the TPMS settings, and of course, TPMS is my world and I can talk to it, but I'm really curious what your guys' thoughts are on that and, how you accommodate or recommend resetting of TPMS.
Well, it's funny you mentioned that, Tyson, because That's exactly what he had to do, right? Because the TPMS set is set to go, I'm telling you, this is your world. I mean, I'm going to phone a friend and ask you the same question here in a second, but TPMS is set to go off at 25% below placard pressure. That's when it's supposed to illuminate, right? 25% below the placard pressure, and then boop, the little light should come on. Well, if placard pressure is 35, it's going to go off at 25% below that. He had to go to 47 PSI, and it would have been, what don't get all mathy on me here, but it would be significantly under even the 30 or 35 PSI he had before. So some tools out there, and you can speak to this, Tyson, better than I can. Some shops have tools that can, and some shops have tools that cannot, right? So we, at times, we have to send folks to the dealership, and sometimes the dealership doesn't even know what to do with it, okay? But the bottom line is we have to inform, I think that's number 5 on your list, Gary, educate the consumer. We have to inform the consumer that, sir, ma'am, your new air pressure is now going to be 47 PSI. We write that down on their work order. We let them know what's going on with it. And we let them know that, hey, when you go to some other places that may want to, quote, help you out, like the oil change places that do the fast lube stuff, right? And you sit in the car and they go through. When they start to grab their air pressure gauge and the air hose, tell them step away from the vehicle, step back, unless you're going to put in 47 PSI. You know, don't set it to the 65 or 80 on the sidewall. Certainly that's wrong. But then don't look at my placard and reduce it to 35 because I have a different application on this vehicle than what it came with. But to kick it back to you, I'm going to phone a friend here, Tyson, if you don't mind. There are a couple tools out there that can let us allow us to adjust placard pressure, correct? For TPMS.
Yeah, that is correct. And I mean, I'm not going to name any brands, but there are tools that will allow you to go in and reflash the ECU. Now, most of these tools have settings in place that allow you to, we got to remember to follow the OE manufacturer spec. So if that's a base model platform, whatever that minimum air pressure is on that tire, right? There's only so many tolerances that you can, or there's limits, I should say, that you can do it within. And again, a couple of those leading tool manufacturers are great at doing that and support, the number one thing that happens when somebody buys a vehicle, right? Which we all know, right? Outfit it with tires and wheels. Gary, what do you, any other thoughts there?
Yeah, I was going to say one of the things that, working through the Wheel and Tire Council, that we also work with tire manufacturers, and we get them to build tires that are like F load range, because they're wider than 12.5. Because once you're wider than 12.5, your max PSI goes down to 65. So if you have a big tire on your 3/4 ton truck, you're used to 80 PSI being a max, and your placard price, your TPMS is set to go up at 65, and that's the pressure you want to run, which is the max on the wider tire. But now they come out with F load rated tires. The max is 80, and you can set it to that 65, 70 and still carry the load and not have your TPMS going off on you.
That's a valid point. Very valid point. Let me grab a couple of these questions in here because we could probably all talk forever. I mean, this is what we do when we get together and we really enjoy it. Again, Ken, thank you for pointing out. I mean, there's lots of competition within the council, the network, within SEMA, but solely within the Wheel and Tire Council, there's competition. But we take our hats off, and you know what? It's all about doing what's right for that end user, the consumer, and the safety side of things. So with that said, let's see. I know we covered a few of these questions already. Let me grab.
While you're looking, Tyson, let me throw this out. I want to make a comment about Ken's conversation about the light truck and his friend. When you say the 10% conversion, everyone's like, well, why do you go 10 up? Why do you go 10 down? It's real simple. If you have a 235, 75, 15, that's a P metric, it's a 105 load index. You look up a 105 load index, it's 2,039 pounds. You look at 235, 75, 15 and LT, and it's a C load range, which is a stronger tire, and its load index is 104, which is 1,985 pounds. And you're like, but I know this tire carries more. It's because they derate it by 10% so that when you put it on, you're going to overload it. But they're already counting on you to overload it, so they got 10% safety built in on top of the regular safety margin.
Yes,
yeah, that's a great. Thank you for going further on that. One thing I'm sorry, Tyson, I'm jumping in on you too. Gary, one of the things we had to be cautious of, and we still have to be cautious of every time we want to, you get the F250s, back in the day, they had the 245, 75, 16s on a 6.5-inch rim, but you had all that room in the wheel well, right? That thing looked like a donut sitting in there. And people came in, they wanted to go 285, 75, 16. And it'll fit fine in the wheel well, but what won't fit on it, Gary?
Well,
The rim,
it depends
the rim
on how
width.
bad you let guys out back, because it's not supposed to go on anything smaller than a 7.5.
That's exactly right. So I think that's one big miss, or one big thing we need to be very conscious of in the industry, that just because you can get the bead to seat on the rim does not mean it's an approved rim width. And that'll change your section width. That'll change a whole lot of things on the fit of that tire and wheel assembly. And it's not you can look in your data books or look on however you have it set up in your location, but any tire, you need to make certain that rim is going to be an approved rim width for it. And that's I think one of the big concerns in the industry we may be missing.
No, very, very good conversation. We got lots of questions coming in too, which is super cool. I don't know how we'll cover all these. We'll figure out a way. Let me run into one. And I'm just gonna try and read it as it is. Is a hard metric always have higher LR and max PSI?
So he's basically asking if a Eurometric is always typically in the same size tire, the air pressure is higher, and it carries more load. But now that they've harmonized, they're pretty much in line with each other. So, like I said, at 225, 60, 16, whether it's at 36 psi or 35, if it's designed to 35 and you put 36 in it, it's the same chamber of air. It's going to carry the same weight. So we in our computer system, we enter that as actually a hard metric or European metric. So in the past, you would say, yes, the harder metrics are a higher load carrying capacity, but now newer ones, they're still making the older designs because they had that size in existence and they've got the plates and they're making the molds. They're not going to change that, but it's just kind of retroactive. If it's made before, if it was a design before this date, they could still make it that way. Just put one more PSI in.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Kent, I have one for you. What happens if you exceed the max inflation pressure of the tire with an overload?
Not good things, typically. You don't want to do that. Okay. I mean, you want to run within whatever load carrying capacity you have to run in. Even if you have, so say you have an extra load range tire or something like that, and your sidewall calls for 30, or your placard calls for 35. I'm going to bump this up to 51. Okay. Well, you're going to cause undue wear on the tire. Typically, you're going to wear out the center of the tires faster. All right. Same way if you have inflated, you're going to wear out the edges of the tire faster. But as far as having it severely overinflated, like the hypermilers want to do, it's not a good thing. It's not a good situation. Tires are incredibly durable, but they're also fallible, right? And you don't need to do anything to help that out, in my opinion.
Right.
I mean, but it all depends on how much you're talking over, because, in the design manuals, you can go 10 PSI over and it's no big deal. But again, like Ken said, you're going to deal with the wear and you might have to wear a kidney belt. You might get better gas mileage because your tire's not going to move, but you're going to move because it's going to shake you.
Jeez. Well, let me take it to another question here. And really, it's a little bit, it expands the scope of tires. Do all 18-wheeler tire brands have the same load carrying index? And is there an industry standard for the 18-wheeler tires construction? I know that's not necessarily your scope, but you want to take a spin at that?
They do have it. The Tire and Rim Association does have a truck and bus category. Very similar in dimensional to light truck applications for the U.S. market, but they do have to factor in camber angle, which basically alters the calculation and it's based on the aspect ratio of the tire. So they're dealing with a lot more turning radius and stuff like that. So they do have harmonized standards, but as far as there's also other standards, ETRTO, which is commercial, the TRA, there's JATMA. But like I say, when it comes to semis, I know there's a formula for it, but we don't really deal. The closest we get is 19.5s on your F450s.
Okay. Speaking of 19.5s, what are, talk about the applications for the LT and commercial fleets. We did have a question about that, about the more common ones. Is there anything to add there?
A lot of the common ones that we're doing is it's just OE replacement or one size up. So it's 225/70 to 245/70. They all work on the same rim width. The guy that's got the F450, he is hauling and he's towing stuff. So they don't really. Majority of them don't change because the Fords come with a nice Alcoa wheel or similar design. So we don't really change much other than maybe a tire size, but that's about it, not much.
Okay. I have an interesting one that, is pretty cool because it's talking about, part of our future, in the EV market. Electric vehicles are steadily increasing in popularity. Are replacement tire options a challenge considering the unique load requirements?
Yes, they are. The torque is on these vehicles is a lot of people misunderstand the torque on them. The one thing I will tell you on electric vehicles is you get your best mileage when your tire's bald because there's no flex in the tread block. So if you're keeping track of your mileage like some of these Prius owners do, and they come in and they buy a tire and they go, my mileage went horribly bad. Well, if you would have bought the exact same OE tire, it would have made a difference too, because anytime you add tread depth, you're adding tread squirm, which is taking away your low rolling resistance. So the low rolling resistance has a lot to do with it. Running higher air pressure can help, but the load's not so much. They're not that heavy. It's just the torque factor. We're seeing a little bit in some Tesla stuff. We're seeing some tires coming back with some issues that we're addressing.
Are you seeing the 21-inch on the rear wearing faster? Because we've seen that a bit.
That's usually a foot problem.
Yeah. It seems like it was a possible factory issue, but can't be proven yet. But
Right.
Back to your point, Gary, of if you want to have the same type of mileage, you want to have the same type of handling, same type of whatever you're used to, then put the same tire back on. That's the easiest sell you can make in the tire world in my business. Hey, did you like the tires you had on there? Anything you didn't like about them? Let's put you right back in the same thing, and that'll take care of some of those issues that you're talking about, Gary. But you're exactly right. We've had this same issue with the Prius owners that, what are you guys doing? You put these tires on there. It's supposed to be low rolling resistance, and well, yeah, it's a new tire. There's going to be some differences for certain.
Yeah, most definitely. So I had another one pop up, and it's funny because we'll never be able to finish this all. I know we have 2 minutes left, so I'll stop talking and get to the question. Quite frankly, if we're allowed to go over, cool. I'll try and stretch that. But so question is, Euro commercial tires, are they considered LT or a different construction?
Well, let me explain. I'm dealing with this right now, and I'm digging into it a little deeper because I just don't take the manufacturer's word for it. I have a tire. It's a 195/70/15, and it's a C. It's a commercial. But on the sidewall, it says load range D, 65 psi. Then you look further around the tire, and it says maximum load 1,985 pounds at 75 psi. What you've got here is American company bringing in a commercial vehicle, homologating it or harmonizing it for the U.S. standard. So it's both. So I haven't gotten a 100% official answer on that tire. But as far as, right now in that particular size, they're the same. But if that tire was to be put at 75, it could carry more, but it says it doesn't. But with any tire, when you add more air, it does add more load. Just manufacturer won't cover that because they want to tell you, hey, it only carries this much. That's why they cut it off at certain standards.
I think we're going to cover the European European commercial metric more, but I want to call out just a couple things. If you look at the Ford vans, the Transits, Chevy with the City Express, Nissan with the NV200, they all did a pretty decent job, regardless of the year, of staying within the same size system, okay? But when you get into the ProMaster and then the Rams, heads up, because in the same year, you could have an LT 225 75 R16 load range E that's a 115R, and the exact same wheelbase, the exact same model, it could be a 225 75 R16C, which is not load range C, it's commercial, and a 121 120R. Well, what's the big difference? Well, quite a bit. You could be looking at around 500 pounds difference potential of load carrying capacity if you put the wrong one on. So be very cautious when you get in, because it is not the same tire. It will not carry the same load. And it's not one you just want to say, hey, bud, grab me a 225 75 16 to throw on here, because you could be in a world of hurt. And again, competitors on the call, but we're all about safety as well. And that's something you don't want to do.
I mean, because if you want to break it down and do the math on it, the tire you just mentioned, the 225 75 16 and the E, there's about a 10% lower load carrying capacity that the LT has versus the commercial. Now, I don't know if it's D-rated or not, or just like if you were to compare the P-metric carries more than both of them. So it's a touchy subject, and we got to look into it a little more, because the formula is more complicated with the Euro commercial, because they're dealing with a lot tighter turning radius, so they have to take into the camber angle, and they got to look at that load when you're cranked it all the way to the left and you're trying to make a UE on a small street, that's European vans are used to making that tight corner and turn. All your load's going to shift, so they have other factors they're dealing with.
Good stuff. I know we are past our time, but let's roll a couple more questions. We're going to break the rules and go over 5 to 10 minutes. There's so much coming in, and so many questions that, this is great stuff. I trust it's valuable for all the viewers as well. So let me run with this one. More on the side of trends, right? Which is good, because you guys see such a large volume of this. What trends are you seeing in truck tires right now, specifically leveled and lifted trucks, and what are maybe a couple popular sizes?
A lot of what we're seeing, and I get phone calls all day, and Kent referred to it earlier, is people want to get the 22 and the 24-inch tire rim diameter, and they want to put a 13.5-inch wide tire on a 14-inch wide wheel, which actually measures 15-inch, because you have a half-inch lip on each side, so you get that stretched look. And that's not the right rim width. You can get a square look, but you don't want a stretched look, because now you're putting undue stress on the shoulder and other things. And yeah, you want to stay within the rim width, because the rim width is based off of the aspect ratio and the width of the tire, and it's a certain percentage rounded to the nearest half inch.
And Gary, on this point, and the reason I kind of brought this one up too, is we're actually going to address this area, stretching tires, if you will, in a future series. So we've already started scoping that out, and definitely look forward to people to attend that and give insight and ask questions. So let me run with maybe one more question here. How about there's the increase in popularity of load range F, and I know we kind of touched on it a little bit. Do you see the load range continuing to increase for LT applications?
Yeah, when you're dealing with, the reason the F came about is the Tire and Rim Association wouldn't allow anything over, I think, a 128 load index in a 17-inch, because they didn't want it to be mixed up with 17.5s. That's why there were never any Fs. And we worked with a lot of manufacturers and got them to rethink it. And now they're coming out with F load range tires. So don't confuse them with 17.5s, but they're usually not, because you guys are dealing with big, wide, 3/4 ton trucks, 35, 37s, stuff like that, and not so much of a issue.
Okay. No, thank you. Couple, these should be really, really simple, short questions, I think. who makes the load carrying capacity numbers? Good question.
Well, I know that Nitto does make a lot of them as well as Toyo. BF Goodrich is starting to. A lot of companies. I think Nikki Thompson is picking up on some, but you know the first ones on the scene are pretty much Toyo and Nitto.
Okay. Thank you. And maybe just one more quick one here. Proper air pressures, and I know, again, we kind of touched on this, but specifically when plus sizing to flotation size tires, what's the best approach? How should they approach this one?
Flotations deal exactly with they have a load index also.
Yep, there's a load inflation table form, and you might be surprised, Gary, with the level of PSI you may or may not need in a high flotation tire. It may be less than what you think because of the design construction of the tire, and I would really suggest folks invest in these charts. You can find them on a lot of places, Gary, right? But you know, the USTMA has a manual out there, right, Tyson? Not to pump somebody else, but we're SEMA. But there's a lot of good information out there as to what we can and cannot do, or should and should not do. But one thing that we want to really drive home is load and inflation, right? You have to know where you're going to be and how much load you need in the tire.
One of the also things you need to keep in mind is what makes a tire flotation, and it's anything 305 millimeters, which is 12 inches and wider, usually goes to the next lower max load index. So if it's an E, which normally has an 80 psi, when it's 12 inches or wider, it goes down to 65 as the max. That, and your C goes down to 35, and your D goes to 50. So they just bump down. The F goes to 80 instead of 90. And that basically on our website, you might see it. We call it a C2 or an E2, where a C2, C1 and an E1 is skinnier than 12 inches and wider than 12 inches is basically call a 2 is the designation we use.
Okay. Thank you. You know, here's two questions we're not going to answer, but I want to throw them out there because actually it ties into something coming up. So understand the difference of installing beadlock wheels and how to explain why they are not DOT approved. Great question. As well as how is the load rating for a particular wheel determined? Awesome questions. Guess what? On December 16th, we are going to do our next webinar series that will be with two industry veterans, again, two wheel experts. Looking forward to all of you attending that. If you're able to, it will be at the same time frame, 12 p.m. Pacific time, 3 o'clock Eastern. We will see about time frame. You know, I know we bled over a little bit. Looks like we got a lot, that 95% are still on, so that's hopefully a good thing. Any feedback we welcome. The best way to share or send other questions, which we're going to follow up and try and figure out a way that we can try and disseminate this information, try and answer a few more of these questions that we weren't able to get to. One of those things, right? But that's a good problem to have. So Nicole B at SEMA.org. Again, Nicole B as in boy, Nicole B at SEMA.org. Feel free to send questions, comments, feedback. We welcome it. We want these to be as successful as we can be, and to give you value back, right? That's what we as volunteers on the Wheel Tire Council do. Gary, Kent, really appreciate your guys' insight, your expertise. I know it's going a long ways today, and thank you for what you do out there.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah, Tyson, thank you very much. Thank you all for calling in and getting on the call. We appreciate that. Keep the questions coming. And again, that feedback will help us be better for you next time.
Outstanding. Gentlemen, thank you. Everybody viewing, thank you. Stay safe. Best of luck and low key during Thanksgiving holiday coming up. Take care. Cheers.
Bye.